Lieutenant General Retired Ken Tovo here. His bio will be in the podcast description, so we are not going to dive too far into that. We are just going to get the show started, and we're going to have an interesting conversation with somebody that has a different perspective on warfare, just because as a special operations professional for many, many years, the perspective on how warfare is executed and how it handles is a little bit different when you start talking about irregular warfare or UW campaigns, or unconventional warfare is the actual term. So if you start looking at irregular warfare, unconventional warfare, there's a different way of applying military force, but just as important to the Department of Defense apparatus as a whole. But without further ado, we'll jump into some questions. We wrote these out, gave them to him prior, so we can have a little bit better discussion. And we'll pivot as we get a little bit deeper into the discussion. But the first thing that you mentioned, sir, in your discussion at the First Flight Venture Center was the importance of rapidly fielding technology to the force. And you started your conversation, with basically a tenet of special operations, that, people are more important than products, for lack of a better term. I understand that's a prevailing sentiment in the special operations community, but how do you see that thought process working in the conventional force, if it does at all?
Yeah, thanks. Well, thanks, Rob. Appreciate you having me on, and I'll jump right in. I think that the overall ethos of the U.S. military is foundationally people focused, right? I mean, we strive to recruit high quality people across all the services, people who are committed to the mission. I mean, essentially, it's a key tenet of the all volunteer force that we created in the 70s. And there's a high emphasis on training personnel to perform their job well under the stressful conditions of combat. All that said, in many parts of the military, the focus is on manning a high-tech system. In the Army, it's crewing an M1 tank or a helicopter or artillery or missile system. In the Navy, it's the ship. In the Air Force, it's the fighter, bomber, or tanker. So the technology is kind of central to mission accomplishment. Obviously, you need the right people to man it and operate it. But in many ways, technology is a central piece of things. I will say much or even most of the special operations community, the person or the team, the group of people are central to the mission. That's how we accomplish the mission, is with complex problem solvers, high quality, well-trained, motivated people who kind of wade into chaotic environments, complex environments, and figure out solutions. There are some conventional analogs as well. I mean, if you look at the infantry, for example, we give them technology, but in the end of the day, it really is more about the weapon system is a platoon or a company, a squad. It's a group of individuals trying to fight as a cohesive team. And while they carry weapons, it's very different a dynamic, I think, than a ship or a tank, a plane.
Yes, sir, I would agree. And I think one of the things that we forget, and it's sadly we're victims of our previous successes. So when you look at the previous war of the last 20 years, we fought a very unsophisticated but deadly enemy. So we weren't looking for like the 73 Eastings, for example. I think that will be the last great tank battle until we fight a larger peer force. And I think there's something to be said about, fighting your last war. And I mean, years ago, there was a book called America's First Battles, and we read that when I was in college, but one of the things that it talked about is how in the interwar period, the U.S. government and the U.S. Army always changes in a direction that isn't always successful when that first engagement of the next war starts. And I think even knowing that, we still continue to fall into this pattern, like, hey, look, we got to draw down the Army. We've got to change our mission focus. Afghanistan is over, so what are we going to do now? And I think it puts the military at unsure footing, just because, philosophies are different. It's also different with politicians. If you have a Republican, Senate Congress president versus a Democrat Senate Congress president, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter for the soldiers executing the orders of the commander in chief. However, what financial support that goes in those military supporting apparatus can change between president to president. And so that also changes the philosophy of how we train and educate the next group of soldiers. So I think there is a very valid point in what you just mentioned. And sir, I could tell you as a guy that transitioned out of the infantry into electronic warfare, it was a big thing for me is starting to develop that soft and conventional interoperability, because as warfare gets bigger, or we go back to a more conventional force on force engagement, the ability for special operations forces, whether that be, the tier 1 guys or the tier 2 guys or whatever, to tie into conventional operations is going to become that much more important, because battle space is going to be at a premium. The spectrum is going to be at a premium. And, one of the things that I have always tried to do is convince, the EW community, because it's a very highly technical field, to get those folks to dip a toe in different types of electronic warfare. So do EW at the schoolhouse, and then do EW for a special forces group or a special mission unit, and then come back to the conventional army, because having that depth and breadth of understanding makes them better operators when it comes down to, the much bigger force, and also being able to get that peek behind the curtain that you wouldn't normally get if I just stayed in, the 82nd my entire career, or the Big Red 1. But I think soft conventional interoperability is one of the things that has kind of gone away. I mean, we did it by habit in the last war, but I don't think it was very intentional, or as intentional as it used to be in the Cold War. I'd just like to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that, you make a valid point. I mean, each part of the Army or the military has got a different focus and a different mission. So from a technical perspective, what you were encouraging your EW operators to do is to see a different slice of it. It's certainly valid. I mean, it broadens their understanding of how their skills might be utilized. And it's different when you're supporting an infantry unit than when you're supporting an SF group. Yeah, the broader point, though, is, this idea of soft conventional force interoperability is a key one. And it was one that was really recognized by senior, at least in the Army, senior Army leadership coming out of the GWAT, if you will, as we've entered this new phase of the operating environment that we alternatively call great power competition or strategic competition. Because I think, you look at it, the leaders of the Army, particularly as I was leaving the Army 2015 to 2018 when I was at Army Special Operations Command, this was a big deal, because leaders in both communities recognized that during the GWAT years of Iraq, Afghanistan, etc., we were more effective together, and that our capabilities are very complementary in many ways, and that we both need the other to really operate at peak performance. And so we learned each other's operating methodologies. We learned the personalities. We used to joke, every time we went to Iraq, it was the same old trunks in the bar, because it was the same conventional guys on their third and fourth tours, same soft guys, etc. So we knew each other intimately, both personally and professionally, etc. And the senior leadership recognized the strength of that, and then said, "How do we maintain this?" The initial conclusion particularly from kind of the conventional Army side was, hey, we need to make sure these soft guys are at every one of our National Training Center and Joint Readiness Training Center rotations, because that's, kind of the pinnacle of where we train and test. And so, from a USASOC perspective, we made a big effort to try and meet that demand, which is a pretty significant burden with all the other op-tempo. But we were at a place when I changed command in 2018 where we had a soft representation at every one of those events. And between NTC and JRTC, it's 20 some odd events a year, in addition to all the other training work. From our side, though, we really emphasize as well home station unit training, interoperability as well, or opportunities for interaction. So whether it was the folks up at Joint Base Lewis McChord or Fort Campbell or Fort Carson, our major locations, almost all of them have a significant Army conventional presence. Relied on local leaders to reach out and establish those same kind of relationships and the same training opportunities, so that we could continue the goodness that we had really developed during the Iraq and Afghanistan. I don't know where that is now. I hope that we've continued to focus on it, because there are some folks out there, particularly kind of when you get up into the the stratosphere of Washington, D.C. and the Pentagon bureaucracy, et cetera, who believe that essentially, hey, now that we're back to fighting peer adversaries, soft is less important. And, it's back to big service fights. And the reality is when you look at, a couple things. First of all, when you look at the reality and history of strategic competition, it more often manifests itself in asymmetric ways, what we call these gray zone conflicts. Very rarely does it escalate into conventional full-scale war, primarily because everybody loses in that kind of a conflict. They're wasteful. Look at World War I and World War II, just the cost in people and treasure. And no side really emerged a great winner, except World War II, you could argue that the U.S. emerged a big winner. But others bore the burden of that war in many ways. So nobody wants to fight that fight, but they still want to achieve their objectives. And so they'll do it in asymmetric ways in other theaters. And a lot of that will mean soft effort. So soft will be important there. And then soft brings a small but important set of capabilities to the conventional battlefield and can help the conventional and joint force solve some of its problems. So I think, those who have studied warfare, who have lived the last 30 or 40 years of warfare, understand that this soft conventional partnership needs to be maintained, and it's going to take senior leader effort to do it, since we're out of the era where we operated, a year at a time together downrange.
Yes, sir. That's a great point. And it goes back to the whole discussion. And I say this all the time, your network is your net worth. And that's kind of in the business sense, but it's also the same when you're in uniform. So if you have the ability to pick up the phone and, if you're the conventional guy, you pick up the phone and you call the task force LNO, and it's somebody that that you serve with either at, home station or at one of these training events like you mentioned, and there's that kinship and rapport and trust that's there, hey, you might get some assets that you wouldn't normally get by being able to communicate with the task force team. Because, hey, look, if you guys aren't busy tonight, I'm going to cut you a line of ISR because I'm not busy, but can I get, one of your lift assets to move something off of a fob or secure a convoy or something to that effect? Because, again, we're all in this together, and the sooner that we realize that, the better off, as an organization we're going to be. And back to your previous points about large platforms, in those large platform battles, when all that stuff is going on, like if you got planes and fighting planes or tanks fighting tanks or ships fighting ships, the other part of it is there's still people involved. And so if you could find a group of folks like an ODA team that can go out and disrupt things early, or do targeting, or provide intelligence, or work human sources, or whatever it is that you can do to enhance the conventional force's ability to target and fight its mission, the better off you're going to be. And I think a lot of people of my contemporaries, in the conventional side, were like, I don't know if I want to use those guys, and they say that in that sense because, oh, well, those guys are cowboys. It's like, well, it's not that they're cowboys. They just have a different mission set and a different set of rules that they operate under. But again, it's all the same team. And it also goes into jointness as well, particularly like when you start talking about use of peer competition. If we go, we got a whole bunch of people coming with us. And that was one of the things that we saw in the fight against ISIS was you had 63 people in a international coalition, some of them Five Eye partners, some of them NATO partners, some of them were from the Horn of Africa, sent guys there as LNOs to kind of study the problem set so they could get better at their mission of fighting terrorism. Wasn't the same kind of terrorism, but they were still trying to learn those TTPs to improve their ability to do counterterrorism operations in their home country. And so being able to bring all those teams together and have a better understanding of that is huge. Plus, from a developmental standpoint, we know that everything's going to be joint and combined from here on out. So if we literally think, if you're in the uniform right now and you think, hey, every time I'm deployed, it's just going to be my unit internally, maybe some Air Force guys that are going to push me overseas, or I'm going to catch a boat or a train or planes or automobiles to get there. But when you show up, you will definitely have a liaison team of some sort operating with you. Ask the guys in the 82nd or ask the guys from 18th Airborne Corps that are currently, supporting operations in Ukraine, from Poland. Like, we're teaching, training, and we're doing a very soft-like mission, even though we don't have soft operators actually assisting with that mission set from the very beginning. But the other part of it is just making sure that people understand joint combined is the way that we're going to go from now and into the future. speaking of Into the Future, that kind of jumps on to the next point of the book from Peter Zehan that you had mentioned. And I started looking up those books. Haven't gotten a chance to read any of them because they're so robust. But the whole discussion of the future of world affairs, or the current state of world affairs and technology on the battlefield, I think those books are imperative for everyone to read. I did read the book called The Kill Chain, which was important. And I think that's another one that you could add to that list. But those 5 books would be very, very important. But I'll pause there and kind of let you expand on the Zehan books, and just what are your thoughts on those books as an author and as a professional military leader? How important is it to have a better understanding of the battlefield, whether it be today or in the future?
Yeah, thanks. Hey, I'll give you a few different books. I'm a big believer in education. We're our sum total of ability to problem solve when we hit a complex problem is a function of our own previous experience, what we've learned in training, and then our educational background. And so, as you look at this whole new national security environment we're facing, I encourage all those I talk to and mentor, hey, you've got to figure out how to shorten that learning curve that's inevitable. You mentioned America's First Battles, and generally the lesson of that book was a study in unpreparedness and our ability to react quickly over time and kind of get where we should have been at the start of a war or a conflict and rapidly close the gap. But part of the way I believe you limit that gap between what you think you're getting ready for and then what you're actually confronted in a new situation is education and the study of history. And when I spoke up in Raleigh, I talked about the Peter Zehan books. The 2 that I've read, it's got 4 out there. I read 1 and 4. The first was The Accidental Superpower, which is really a great historical lesson, even for those of us who think we know American history, in how America became the world superpower. And his view or his lens that he uses to analyze things is very much focused around demographics, populations, and then geography. And so in that first one, he kind of lays out all the reasons that the U.S. has just a phenomenal set of geographic and demographic advantages that led us to being a superpower. And then he kind of goes around the world and he analyzes from the same lens a lot of the other key players in the world and highlights some of the challenges they face. And he does a little bit of that same thing in his 2022 book, The End of the World is Just the Beginning, but it's much more contemporary. Obviously, it's written 8 years later. But the other piece of it is he really focuses on this idea of China as the kind of the China-U.S. relationship is the central aspect of the current and future operating environment. And he paints a different picture, I would say, than some of the things that people are talking about. The inevitable rise of China, how they're inevitably going to replace the U.S. as the superpower in the world, and kind of gives all the reasons why he does not agree that's going to happen. But I think also talks about the fact that just because they may be peaked power, and that's his thesis essentially, and how one with significant vulnerabilities at that does not mean that there's not a high danger of conflict. Anyway, I think it's one of those things. If you're interested in the world we live in now and trying to understand, that is definitely a pair of books to read. On the topic of China, I'll give you a couple others. A little bit more strategic and perhaps theoretical. Graham Allison, Destined for War: Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap? This idea that the superpower when challenged, the superpower in control of the world or in a leading position faced with a rising power, it almost always reverts to conflict. How do you stop that? And it's an interesting analysis. But if you want to know how we got here, Michael Pillsbury's The 100-Year Marathon, China's Secret Strategy to Replace America as the Global Superpower, is a pretty good summation of what I would call failed foreign policy. He was actually an advocate of this idea that if we embrace China and help them rise, eventually capitalism will moderate the Chinese Communist Party's authoritarian government. And essentially he concludes, hey, that's a failed strategy, failed hypothesis. And we need to change how we address China. You mentioned Christian Bros and the Kill Chain. I think it's a great book to identify, particularly for your business leaders. It highlights quite some of the technical challenges we face, which you could look at from a business perspective as opportunities for business. Because in the end, the key of technology is what problem does it solve on a battlefield. And I think Bros does a pretty good job laying that out. He was intimately familiar with the military acquisition system. So one of the other things he does is kind of lay out all the challenges of the current DoD acquisition system, which are also a pretty good primer for business to understand the obstacles that'll be in there. And then the last book I'll give you, for those of you who are into a little bit more of a fictional approach, or what we call useful fiction, Ghost Fleet by P.W. Singer and August Cole, essentially is a futuristic, set in 2026 conflict between China and the U.S. that incorporates a lot of the current technology and highlights how technology might impact a future battle. So I think all of those are well worth reading to understand this technological world we live in, the rise of China, how that can impact our lives, and sort through all the things we see on TV day in day out.
Yes, sir. I think that's one of the things that we all have to understand. I think lifelong learning is important, and it's super cliche to say this, but those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. And I think if we don't take the opportunities that we have, given like all the contemporary authors, then former, government people that are writing on these topics that are current, but also impact the future directly, is we're missing out on a really great opportunity to improve as a force, but it's also self-improvement as an individual to understand these things better. Because as you said, if I'm a business that does artificial intelligence or machine learning or, unmanned systems, how do I get to the point where I'm viable, where the government will take a look at me for purchase or services or whatnot? But I think there's a huge part.
You'll often... Oh, sorry, go ahead. No, I was going to say, you'll often hear this cliche that the military always fights the last war. And to some extent, if you think about it, that's a function of, we're all victims of our experience. And so if you're in today's military, most of the folks in today's military grew up knowing nothing other than the post 9/11 era, a war very focused on counterinsurgency, counterterrorism. And so if all they take into the future is their own experience, they're going to be bounded by that and in many ways hindered by it. A lot of what they experienced will be valid going forward, but there's a set of experiences that they have not had, and the only way they can gain those experiences is through the study of history, because there really is, nothing new under the sun. I mean, we're living today in a world very much like the one I started out my military career in, when we were pitted against the Soviet Union. So we've lived great power competition before and peer competitors, et cetera. But most of the folks in uniform today, and in fact, most of the folks in the defense industry today, know one set of experiences, and they all need to figure out how to broaden that and understand what it might be like in a future war. And if you look at what's happening in Ukraine right now, we're already getting those glimpses of that, right? We grew up in a global war on terrorism, Iraq, Afghanistan, where we could afford just-in-time supply. As you mentioned earlier, we had a dangerous but low-tech adversary. And so, it wasn't a high volume of combat power in a lot of regards. And now we look at what's happening in Ukraine. I mean, literally in the Ukrainians are shooting more artillery shells in a month than we produce in a year. We're being reminded as we watch of what conventional conflict means in terms of mass and quantity, things that we didn't see for the 20 years of the G.
Yes, sir. And I mean, one of the things that the obvious difference is air superiority. You throw up a two-ship of Apaches and a couple jets, and you had air superiority over the countries that we were fighting against in Iraq and Afghanistan, because the enemy didn't have an air force. And then the threat of drones basically became their avenue of attack from the air, because it was ubiquitous, it was easy to launch, and it was very difficult to stop in the early part of the war because of the techniques that they were using. And if you look at even at the war in Ukraine, nobody remembers, and I say nobody, there's very few people that are currently in uniform that remember, hey, at 36 hours out, the Bragg is going to be shooting at all major targets. At 24 hours out, the RAG is going to be shooting at all these major targets. And people forget those big, huge moving pieces from the old Op 4 manual that used to be like 6 inches thick that we used to have to read as lieutenants and junior officers in the military to understand how the enemy is going to fight. And that change of knowledge, it didn't happen fast enough. One, because we were so engulfed in the last 20 years of fighting GWOT, but the other part of it is I didn't really have time to study, what the Russians were doing, because I had to be careful of where the next IED was coming from or where the next threat was coming from. So, of course, priority of education is survival, of course, but now that we're in this interwar period, we need to, take advantage of the time and kind of develop at least the mental flexibility to attack those next problem sets. And when you look at some of the things that we're doing with Project Convergence and looking at the 2035 initiatives that the Army has, we're looking down the road, but even still, 2035, that's 12 years away, but that 12 years is going to go by so incredibly fast that if we're not attacking the problem set today, we are going to be behind in 2025, 2035, and beyond. And that's one of the things that, is incredibly frustrating as a former EW professional, is seeing the robust capability that China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea have in the EW space, and then hearing that, the Army does have a plan for ground EW, but it's only going to be fielded to the following 3 units over the next 15 years. Well, that doesn't help if we go into a full-scale peer-on-peer battle that has a robust capability in the electronic warfare space. And for those of you guys that don't know, cyber ISR is a thing. People are conducting surveillance, people are conducting messaging and PSYOPs campaigns on a daily basis. I say this all the time, and I'll say it one more time. If your kids are on TikTok, please get them off. TikTok is a Chinese weapon, period, point blank. It may be entertaining, it may be fun, but there's also science that proves like the longer your kids check into social media, regardless of what platform it is, the more harm that it does to them. So, unpaid political announcement, but monitor what your kids are using on their apps, because those apps will pivot into other things. It's like everybody always asks, like, man, I was talking to my wife the other day about new running shoes, and the next thing you know, I logged into my Gmail account, or I logged on to Google, and like the first thing that pops up in my search is running shoes. Well, that's the AI listening to you. And those of you guys that have Wi-Fi on your home network, any computer that's attached to that router is going to have the same kind of feedback. Now imagine if you allow the adversary entry into your personal private network through an app on your kid's phone. And I will pause there, sir. But what are your thoughts on just like the growing sentiment of the cyber initiatives that are going on out there? And how do you think that would impact the current operations or even future operations for special operations?
Yeah, you described the challenge here in America is we're an open society. Right, we let people have access to all these things. We haven't built the Great Firewall around the country as folks like China, Russia, and Iran have done to try and keep out external influence through the cyber domain. And so it's a challenge. We're a country that allowed China to come and invest millions of dollars and create Chinese, quote, cultural centers at our major universities and colleges around the country that essentially are influence platforms to influence academic thought, to proselytize, but also as intelligence collection platforms. Everybody's focused this weekend on a balloon that flew over and it likely has collected and sent back to China significant collection data. Obviously, they did it and took the risk to do it because they felt there was value and gain in it. So we must presume that, as they flew over nuclear facilities and other things, they learned things that they didn't know before. But we've also allowed them a almost unhindered presence in our nation, with hundreds of thousands of Chinese living here, going to our schools, learning our academic secrets, etc., and then taking them back to China. Not to mention what has happened with industrial and security espionage through the cyber domain. There's at one point they had the entire Office of Personnel Management database on everybody in government. Everybody who had a security clearance, they had their personal data from back in 2011, 2012 when they breached the OPM database. So, this isn't something new. China has been running roughshod over our information domain for quite some time, and I think it's about time we got serious about it. Maybe it takes a balloon going over the continental United States to do that, but I'm hoping that we're going to wake up and understand it. From a soft perspective, I know the community right now is trying to figure out how to work more closely with the cyber professionals and the space professionals so that we can take some of those synergies we talked about between the conventional force and SOF and explore the same things with some of these other capabilities, cyber and space particularly. All of those, I think, are key enablers to the future operating environment. Whether we're operating in denied territory and we've got to exfil data largely through space, how do we bring intel forward to our folks who are on the edge through space-based and cyber-based capabilities, but also how do we leverage particularly the cyber domain to do what is a key aspect of special operations, which is this interaction and influence and understanding of other populations. One of the things that SOF brings to warfare is establishing contact and understanding with the population in key locations and in contested environments. The war is not pristine. It takes place in and around populations, and in the end, war is all about subduing an adversary and bending him to your will. And a large part of that is convincing the population that they have been defeated. Arguably, what we failed to do in Iraq after the invasion of 2003 was convince the population that they were beaten. And so you have to have a force that's able to interact, understand, and then influence that population. That's a big part of what SOF does. And so I think some of that can be done through cyber, some of it's done face-to-face. And so I think, the community right now is grappling with how to take advantage of the cyber connectivity and the access it provides into populations, friendly, neutral, adversarial.
Yes, sir. I 100% agree. I think if there is a way, and I'm sure that there is, that somebody is thinking about or it's already done, that we just don't know about, to penetrate the Great Firewall of China and start putting out information that is necessary to convince the people that, like, hey, maybe your government isn't doing the right thing. And it's difficult to do because one of the things that we have to be cautious of, particularly when dealing with foreign countries, regardless of if it's wherever in the world, is indoctrination. So indoctrination starts for many of those countries at a very, very young age. And so that's like part of their parochial school education is hating America. And we have to understand that we have adversaries out there that are like that and will just as soon, pull the trigger on you as they would steal your data. And as a community of interest, what we can do, both whether we're in the uniform, out of the uniform, supporting or providing some kind of service or capability to the government, is to ensure that we do everything that we can, one, to protect intellectual property. As you previously said, if you have never looked at the Chinese car market or their aircraft or their drones or anything in the military or in the commercial sector, it literally is an exact copy physically of a U.S. car, plane, boat, train, whatever. The difference is sometimes they don't have the deep down proprietary information that kind of makes it tick like in the US, but on an aesthetic look, it looks the exact same. They have a Range Rover that looks like a Range Rover from the US. They have, drones that look like Predators, even though they're not Predators. And the other difference, particularly from a business standpoint or from a governmental standpoint, is we're not working together as a whole of government, whether that be the commercial entities or the United States government, because hey, Google and Microsoft get a vote. If they don't want to work with the government, they don't have to. Whereas in China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, that is a whole of government approach. Hey, you are going to, you've demonstrated, the ability to do math. We're going to send you to university in the States. You're going to come back here and you're going to build nukes for us. Or you're going to come back here and build planes for us. Or you're going to do this avionics education curriculum, and then you're going to come back and build our next plane. And so one of the things that we have to consider is that's a huge difference. And like you said, open society, the amount of freedom that we have in the United States it's an advantage because everybody wants to come here, but it's also a disadvantage when it comes to presenting, a whole of country approach to war, which we haven't seen since World War II. And I hope that we never get to that point, because that would be a frightening thing to have to, hey, look, as a retiree, like, you're no longer able to suit up and fight the war, but guess what you can go do? You can go work in a factory and build munitions. Like, that would be a scary thing to have happen. But if we have a total war, that's what everybody in our society has to do. But we've been so insulated from that because, like, think about it, the guys that went to World War II are in their 80s and 90s now. And so that part of our society is very, very small and shrinking. There's only about 200,000, World War II vets still alive, and that number is shrinking every day. So pretty soon we could potentially, have an era of 20 or 30 years where nobody has experienced war on that scale. And again, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. But sir, I'll give you the last word before we close this thing out. I really appreciate your time today. This was a very compelling discussion. But if there's anything that you're doing or any organizations that you're supporting or agencies, please just, here's your chance to give them a plug, and we'll close this thing out. And I appreciate your time today. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. And I've enjoyed the conversation. I do think, my call to your listeners would be, we are in a dangerous time. You do need to understand the forces of history that are driven. One of the things out of the Peter Z. Hand books that talks about is essentially from World War II on, we've lived in a period of unprecedented world peace. Now, of course, it doesn't seem like that sometimes because we've bounced from one, quote, small war to the next, but it really is unprecedented. But it's not guaranteed for the future. And so I think people have... I think Ukraine being invaded by Russia woke some people up, but I think we're still somewhat complacent in our approach to things and need to understand that the world is dangerous and it's getting worse, and particularly with regard to China and a lesser extent Russia. We need to get serious about the competition and potential conflict that faces us. Since you gave me the opportunity to plug, I will. In my free time, I chair the Green Beret Foundation, a nonprofit focused on supporting Green Berets, past, present, and their families. And would, if you're looking for a charity out there to support, I'd ask you to consider the Green Beret Foundation. We're doing great stuff for some of America's finest citizens who literally are day in, day out around the world, 70 countries, doing the nation's business. And they're on the leading edge of the U.S. military around the world. So with that, thanks for the opportunity, and I'll look forward to another engagement at some point in the future.
Awesome. Thanks, sir. And again, this is Rob Robinson for Defense Technology Talks, coming at you from the North Carolina Defense Technology Transition Office, or DEFTech, and for Lieutenant General Retired Ken Tovo and myself. We really appreciate your time today. Hopefully you learned something. If you didn't, there's going to be a whole bunch of links in the podcast description so you can read more about some of the topics that we covered. And don't be afraid to explore something new. If you're a small business and you're not decided on whether or not you want to work with the military, give your DefTech team a call and we can help kind of vector you in and give you some opportunities that may be helpful. If you're currently doing business with the government, please reach out because we're always looking for teaming partners. And last but not least, we thank you guys for your time today, and we will talk to you guys next time. Thanks. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Defense Technology Talks, hosted by the North Carolina Defense Technology Transition Office, or DefTech. The full version of this presentation has been uploaded to our Mobilize platform. Mobilize is another free service that we provide to access more national security business and collaboration opportunities. You can also sign up for more information at deftech.nc.gov. Join us again soon for our next podcast coming to a platform near you.